The Big Gundown was not just Sergio Sollima's most ferociously political film. It was a Marxist manifesto disguised as a spaghetti western that nearly destroyed itself before a single frame was shot. And what Columbia Pictures did to it when it crossed the Atlantic is one of the most calculated acts of ideological surgery ever performed on a foreign film by an American studio. We are digging into the wreckage of the Big Gundown. With 20 secrets, the industry tried to bury secrets locked inside Italian Communist Party membership files, Columbia Pictures editing memos, out-of-print screenwriting correspondence, and one very candid conversation between Ennio Morricone and a dead German composer. The Italian title of this film is La Resa dei Conti. It does not mean the Big Gundown. It means the settling of scores, a phrase with explicit economic and political weight, the language of debt collection, of class reckoning, of what happens when the poor finally present their invoice to the powerful. Columbia Pictures' position on the original title is what their internal editing memo record makes plain. They wanted a title that announced a Western, not a political treatise. The Big Gundown is a title that describes a shootout. La Resa dei Conti is a title that describes a revolution. Columbia chose the shootout. What they tried to erase is that the revolution is the entire point of the film, embedded in its original name and nowhere in its replacement. But the real problem was that the title was not the only thing Columbia decided to replace. By 1966, Sergio Sollima had spent the previous 18 months directing 3 Eurospy pictures that capitalized on the James Bond craze, technically competent, politically inert, and almost entirely forgotten before they finished their theatrical runs. The Italian critical establishment regarded genre filmmaking as industrial surrender, and Sollima was living inside a paradox, familiar to every intelligent filmmaker working in commercial cinema. The work that paid was the work that was dismissed. A quote attributed to Sollima in later interviews cuts directly to the condition. He characterized the highbrow Italian films of the era as the critics' darlings, and described the gap between them and genre cinema not as aesthetic, but as class. The same intellectuals who ignored spaghetti westerns were the ones writing about the oppressed. The Big Gundown was Sollima's attempt to make the intellectuals wrong about both the genre and themselves. Either the film proved that popular cinema could carry serious political argument, or it confirmed that he was exactly the commercial hack the critics already believed him to be. This is exactly why every creative decision he made on this film was simultaneously an artistic choice and an existential gamble. The original story on which The Big Gundown is based was written by Franco Salinas and Fernando Morandi. The name Franco Salinas will mean nothing to most audiences who have seen this film. It should mean everything. Salinas was a teenage partisan during World War II, a card-carrying member of the Italian Communist Party, a journalist for the communist newspaper L'Unità, and, at the precise moment he provided the treatment for Sollima's film in 1966, the co-author of what would become one of the most politically dangerous films in the history of cinema, The Battle of Algiers. The same man who constructed a near-documentary account of anti-colonial uprising, whose screenplay was so inflammatory that the Pentagon would screen it 40 years later as a training aid for understanding insurgent tactics, that man wrote the foundational story of what became The Big Gundown. The film's political DNA does not merely resemble The Battle of Algiers. It was grown in the same laboratory, by the same scientist, from the same ideological material. But the real problem is what Salinas' story originally was, and where it was originally set. The original Salinas-Morandi treatment did not take place in the American West. It was set on Corsica. The entire narrative architecture, the fugitive, the corrupt baron, the bounty hunter whose institutional faith corrodes, was designed for a Mediterranean context, a landscape of French colonial tension and Corsican banditry. When Sergio Donati and Sollima adapted the treatment into a spaghetti western screenplay, they transplanted the story so thoroughly that Salinas received credit only for the original idea, not for the screenplay, because, as the spaghetti western database's production records make explicit, the script had been altered so completely that his authorship of the dramatic architecture was structurally obscured. The western setting was not an artistic interpretation of Salinas' story. It was a commercial decision that consumed the story's specific geography while preserving its precise political argument. Salinas was paid for an idea. The idea was rebuilt into a different building. His fingerprints are on every wall. This is exactly why film historians who call The Big Gundown a spaghetti western have always been slightly wrong. It is a Corsican anti-colonial allegory wearing a Stetson. The role of Cuchillo Sanchez was originally intended for Gian Maria Volonté. This detail, disclosed by Sollima himself in archive interview footage included on the Grindhouse releasing Blu-ray, carries a weight that requires a moment to absorb. Volonté was the political actor of his generation, a committed left-wing activist who had just come off career-defining villain performances in both A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. The original conception of Cuchillo was designed for an older man, a figure of weathered, explicit political consciousness, a disillusioned veteran of Juarista revolutionary politics. The casting of Tomas Milian required a complete reimagining. What Volonté would have played as a study in political disillusionment, Milian transformed into something more physically alive and more subversively funny. A trickster whose intelligence is precisely what the powerful cannot account for because they have never extended to him the dignity of believing he has any. The character became better for the replacement. The argument became more dangerous. But the real problem was that what Milian brought to the role came from a place the production had not anticipated. Tomas Milian, born in Havana, trained in method acting by Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, a student of the same institution that produced Brando and James Dean, arrived at the Big Gundown in a state of professional desperation he never quite advertised. After 5 years in what he considered intellectual Italian cinema that earned critical respect and no popular recognition, he was preparing to abandon Italy entirely when a spaghetti western called The Bounty Killer gave him enough money to reconsider. He was a method actor attempting to disappear into a Mexican peasant whose culture was not his own in an Italian-Spanish co-production filmed in Almeria by a director whose politics he actively disagreed with. He was, in the most biographical sense, a political exile from Cuba playing a political refugee from Mexico. His father, a Cuban general, had been arrested, jailed, and committed suicide. Milian had fled. Cuchillo, in the film, has nowhere left to flee to. Every scene of flight, of surviving within a system designed to destroy him, Milian was playing it from the inside out, and the camera caught something no screenplay direction could have requested. This is exactly why his performance is not acting in the conventional sense. It is autobiography encoded as genre cinema. Lee Van Cleef arrived at the Big Gundown carrying one of the stranger resumes in American acting history. He had declined to have his nose surgically altered when he debuted in High Noon in 1952, a decision that relegated him to a non-speaking outlaw role when the studio wanted a sympathetic face and he refused to manufacture one. For a decade, his hatchet face confined him to minor villain parts that used him the way a film uses a prop, to signal danger without requiring it to be explained. Then a near-crippling car accident in 1959 shattered his leg, his arm, and his kneecap. When Sergio Leone cast him in For a Few Dollars More in 1965, Van Cleef was a man physically rebuilt after being professionally discarded. Jonathan Corbett, the bounty hunter who pursues an innocent man on behalf of a corrupt patron, was his first starring role in any film. He was 41 years old. The institutional confidence Corbett carries in the film's opening act, the certainty that the law is clean and the man who enforces it is above the transaction. Van Cleef played it with an actor's knowledge of exactly how that certainty gets dismantled. He had watched it happen to his own body and his own career simultaneously. But the real problem was that the studio releasing his performance had already decided his role was worth less than they were selling. Columbia Pictures acquired The Big Gundown for American distribution in 1968. The Italian theatrical cut ran 110 minutes. The version Columbia released ran 89 minutes. 21 minutes disappeared between Rome and New York, and the Columbia Pictures editing memo makes clinically clear that the cuts were not random. The version of Corbett that American audiences saw was, in the precise language of the Grindhouse releasing comparison documentation, a man who appears to more quickly resort to violence compared to his level-headed characterization in the Italian version. The missing minutes are exactly the minutes in which Corbett's faith erodes gradually, in which the moral argument accumulates through evidence rather than announcement. Columbia removed the demonstration and kept the announcement. What remained was a Western with a gesture toward political complexity. What had been removed was the political complexity itself. A second English version, running 85 minutes, went further. It removed all references to the rape and murder which drives the story. The film's moral engine, the accusation that weaponizes racism, that turns an innocent man into a criminal by the mere act of a powerful man's word, was excised entirely. What survived was a chase movie. This is exactly why the American critical conversation about The Big Gundown in 1968 bore almost no relationship to the film Sollima had actually made. The editing was only part of the intervention. Dubbing was standard practice for Italian genre films entering the American market. What was not standard was the extent to which the dubbing script altered the political content of individual exchanges. Scholars with access to both versions have documented that lines in which characters articulate class analysis, naming the railroad baron's motivation as economic rather than moral, describing the structural relationship between political power and legal accusation, were rendered in softer, more generic terms that preserve the surface of the scene while evacuating its argument. The English version of Jonathan Corbett is a man who realizes he has been deceived. The Italian version of Jonathan Corbett is a man who realizes he is a mechanism of class oppression. These are not the same revelation, but the real problem was not only what Columbia removed from Sollima's film, it was what they added to the marketing. When Columbia released The Big Gundown in the United States, the marketing positioned the film as trading on the success of Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, in which Van Cleef had played the villain, Angel Eyes. Columbia's promotional approach attempted to market Van Cleef as if he were Eli Wallach, who had played the comic, grotesque Tuco. Reviewers at the time noted the confusion explicitly. The marketing so aggressively conflated the two actors that the studio appeared to have no understanding of which cast member they were selling. The irony collapses in on itself. A film about a man falsely accused of being someone he is not, sold to American audiences by a studio that publicly confused its star with someone else entirely? This is exactly why the film earned only $2 million in its U.S. theatrical run, despite being, in its original form, one of the finest westerns ever made. Ennio Morricone's score contains, embedded in a cue called The Verdict, an extended quotation from Beethoven's Bagatelle in a minor universally known as ferociously. In a 2019 interview reproduced by Oxford University Press's academic blog, Morricone described the collision of those two musical traditions, the ordered, bourgeois architecture of 19th century German piano music, and the raw, percussive grammar of Sollima's Western as the film's central argument rendered in sound. The Beethoven represents institutional Europe, clean, structured, historically legitimized. The guitar and percussion that surround it represent what that institution cannot contain. What Morricone built was not a film score. It was a musical argument about the same power relationship Sollima was making on screen. The score worked so completely that Sollima considered the Beethoven quotation a lucky charm and asked Morricone to open each of his subsequent two films with it. Morricone complied. But the real problem was that the score would travel further than the film and arrive in places that had no idea where it came from. In 2009, Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds opened to global release. The first sustained music audiences heard accompanying SS officer Hans Landa's arrival at a French farmhouse. The silence before the interrogation begins was the verdict. Morricone's ferociously cue from The Big Gundown. Morricone himself described Tarantino's use of the cue with wry philosophy. The composer had borrowed from Beethoven, Tarantino borrowed from him. And somewhere in that chain of appropriation, the question of original authorship dissolves into the question of who used the material most precisely. The Big Gundown's music spent 4 decades in relative obscurity before Tarantino placed it in front of the largest audience either piece of work had ever reached. Most of those audiences had never heard of Sergio Sollima. Many of them still have not. This is exactly why Morricone's score for The Big Gundown is simultaneously one of the most heard and least credited achievements in the history of film music. What Salinas contributed to The Big Gundown, beyond his story credit, was a conceptual grammar. The fugitive as the morally superior figure. The institutional pursuer as the vehicle of elite power rather than justice. The corrupt wealthy patron as the real criminal. The border as the site where legal authority reveals its true nature as property protection. These are not Western conventions. They are anti-colonial arguments. The Battle of Algiers made them about Algeria. The Big Gundown made them about the American-Mexican frontier. In 1966, both films played simultaneously in Italian cinemas. Their screenwriter went home at night to the same desk. But the real problem is that the political argument had a source even further upstream than Salinas. The Big Gundown draws heavily from the structural grammar of Delmer Daves's 1957 Hollywood Western 3:10 to Yuma. A lawman tasked with delivering a prisoner, repeated escapes and recaptures, a developing moral relationship between pursuer and pursued that gradually inverts the audience's sympathies. Sollima never credited this influence publicly, and the Italian film industry's long tradition of not crediting influences rendered any formal acknowledgement structurally unnecessary. What Sollima did with the borrowed structure was transform it. The Hollywood film's moral architecture is finally conservative, its institutional faith restored at the conclusion. Sollima's film ends by destroying that faith completely. He borrowed the chase. He refused to borrow the ending. This is exactly why The Big Gundown is not a copy of 3:10 to Yuma. It is a reply. The character of La Viuda, the widow, played by Nieves Navarro, exists in the Italian cut as something the genre almost never produced. A female authority figure whose violence is neither punished nor explained away as hysteria. She commands a band of outlaws with a whip and a contempt for sentiment the film presents not as pathology but as competence adapted to circumstance. Her loneliness visible beneath the authority is not offered as a softening detail. It is offered as a consequence of having survived in a landscape designed to eliminate her. The Columbia cut reduced her screen time. The Italian version gave her a moral argument. The American version gave her a supporting role. That editing decision is precisely the one that reveals most clearly what Columbia understood itself to be selling and to whom. But the real problem was not only what Columbia did to La Viuda. It was what the Italian critical establishment did to the film as a whole. Italian critics in 1967 received The Big Gundown with a condescension so thorough it functioned as institutional blindness. The highbrow establishment found in it confirmation of their prejudice. They saw a spaghetti western with political decoration, not a political argument using the western as its vehicle. That distinction matters because it is the same distinction that separated the film Sollima made from the film Columbia released. In both cases, an institution encountered radical content and processed it as familiar entertainment. The Italian critics dismissed it as genre. Columbia stripped it as product. Both responses achieved the same result. The argument was addressed to an audience that had been prevented from receiving it. The American press was blunter. Reviews evaluated the film as the shoot-'em-up it had been marketed as, and found it adequate. Not one major American review in 1968 identified the Salinas connection, the Battle of Algiers DNA, the Corsican origin of the story, the 21 missing minutes, or the rewritten English dialogue. They reviewed the film Columbia made. That film was adequate. The film Sollima made was something considerably more dangerous. Sergio Sollima died in Rome in 2015 at 94. The obituary published by Variety quoted Italian pop culture scholar Marco Giusti's assessment with a directness that serves as both epitaph and manifesto. In Sollima's films, the bandits, the poor, and the exploited become the heroes, and the bad guys are always capitalist Yankee exploiters. What Giusti could not have anticipated is that Sollima's directorial legacy would continue genetically through his son Stefano, director of Gomorrah, Italy's most successful television export, a show about the Neapolitan Camorra, in which institutional power and organized crime are presented not as opposites, but as expressions of the same structural logic. The argument the father made in the Almeria Desert in 1966 is still being made by his son on streaming platforms with global audiences. The setting changes, the settling of scores continues. This is exactly why the original Italian title of this film is the most honest description of everything the Sollima family ever made. In 2009, Tarantino put Morricone's Big Gundown score in front of the largest audience either piece of work had ever reached. In 2013, Grindhouse Releasing issued the first American physical release of the film in any format 45 years after its U.S. theatrical run, restoring the 21 missing minutes in a 4-disc set that is among the most forensically thorough home video releases in genre history. In 2022, the Criterion Channel added the film to its library. MoMA screened the full Italian cut with framing that positioned it alongside, rather than beneath, the recognized masterpieces of the Western genre. Tarantino included it in his list of 20 favorite spaghetti westerns. None of this rehabilitation addresses the 21 minutes American audiences in 1968 never saw. None of it restores the political argument the English dubbing softened into sentiment. What it does is confirm that the film Sollima made, not the film Columbia released, was worth the argument all along. The film that survived production is not the film Sollima finished. It is a film with 21 minutes removed, its dialogue rewritten in translation, its title stripped of its political meaning, its star confused with a different actor in its own marketing materials, and its original source material, a Corsican anti-colonial treatment written by the same man who wrote The Battle of Algiers, nowhere acknowledged on its credits. What remains, even in its damaged American form, is still more politically serious than almost anything the Hollywood Western produced in the same decade. What exists in the Italian cut is a film the culture of 1967 was not equipped to receive, and that the culture of 2026 is only beginning to understand how to discuss. The question the film leaves, embedded in its narrative, like a knife thrown into good wood, is this. If the same political argument that the law is a weapon wielded by the wealthy against the poor that accusations are instruments of class control, that the man you are hunting is innocent and the man who sent you is the criminal, was made simultaneously in 1966 by the most serious political cinema and the most commercially disreputable genre cinema. And one of those versions was screened at Venice and nominated for 3 Academy Awards, while the other had 21 minutes cut out of it before American audiences were permitted to see it. What does that tell you about which arguments a culture will tolerate and in which containers it will allow them to arrive? Leave that in the comments. The settling of scores is the point. If this investigation changed how you see the Big Gundown, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried arguments that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.